let people in. Well, hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to wherever you're joining us from. My name is Daniel Beeben. I'm here representing the Board of Directors of the Association for the Study of Persian Age Societies. And I'd like to welcome you all to our second ASPS virtual event of this year. We are very pleased today to offer our first ever virtual event on the theme of archaeology in the Persianate world. And we'll be hearing today a presentation on some recent findings from an ongoing research project from the Oasis of Bukhara. We have with us today two members representing this research team, both of whom are from the Institute of Iranian Studies of the Academy of Sciences of Austria in Vienna. Dr. Gabriele Puschnigg has conducted extensive research on ceramics from Central Asia, specifically from the late Iron Age to the early Islamic period. She's authored a book on this topic, as well as various contributions and articles on the subject. We also have with us today Dr. Jacopo Bruno, who is a postdoctoral fellow at the Institute. He specializes in the study of material cultural and pottery production of regions including Central Asia, northeastern Iran, and southern Mesopotamia from the pre-Islamic to the early Islamic period. We also have with us today our discussant, Dr. Michael Shenkar, who is an associate professor at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Dr. Shenkar studies the civilizations and cultures of the pre-Islamic Iranian world through their material remains and visual representations. His research interests encompass the archaeology, art, and religions of pre-Islamic Iran and Central Asia, including Zoroastrianism, the culture of Eurasian nomads, Sogdian civilization, and the Silk Roads. And he's also the co-director of the excavations of the Sogdian site of Sanjar Shah in northern Tajikistan. Before we begin, I would also like to thank our co-sponsors for this virtual event series, the Sharmin and Bijan Musavar Rahmani Center for Iran and Persian Gulf Studies at Princeton University, who have provided the technical support for this event. I should also note that this event is being recorded and the video will be posted later to be made available on the ASPS website. So our format for today, we will first hear from our two presenters, then I will turn things over to Michael for some comments and questions to the presenters, and then we will open things up to questions from the audience, and we'll try to wrap things up within 90 minutes today. So I'll turn things now over to Gabriele. Go ahead.
Hello, good evening, and and good afternoon. And thank you very much for your kind introduction. And thank you for providing us with the opportunity to share our research with a wider audience. Our title, 1001 Sherds, the Material History of the Bukhara Oasis, is not only an allusion, but it's also a symbolic description of what we are dealing with, namely a huge amount of pottery fragments. And much of this talk is going to be about how the first part of the title is going to relate to the second part, the material history. We begin. Sorry, I just need to find how to go on to the next slide. Yes, now it works. So we begin with the project history because our project is part of a wider network of research programs, and the chronology of these programs has a direct impact on our research strategies. And then we're going to introduce some of the basic theoretical concepts that lie behind our approaches. And we're going to inform you about our first results and insights, and also give you an outlook on our future procedures. Let's begin with the project history then. At the beginning, there was the French-Uzbek mission in the Bukhara Oasis, closely followed by a historical research program undertaken by Florian Schwarz here at the Institute of Iranian Studies at the Austrian Academy of Sciences. And finally, we joined in from 2016 onwards with our research on the material history. As you can see from the project aim, all of these three projects actually have a long durée perspective. First of all, the archaeological MAFOUB project is dealing with the transformation of settlement patterns in conjunction with water systems and cultural development. Florian Schwarz was looking in the reconstruction of the landscape history of the oasis, and we are aiming at reconstructing everyday life in the long durée with a focus on integrated ceramic research. And finally, we are very happy to welcome Jacopo Bruno to the Institute from next week with his new project, A Tale of Pots and People, which is part of an ASPS program. As you can see, the first parts are now published. It started with the first volume on the archaeology of the oasis. Then the second volume contains also the historical research, and the third volume just came out this May and also contains our preliminary findings regarding the pottery research. Now, how does our ceramic research fit within the ceramic studies that were previously done in the oasis and are still ongoing? First of all, most of these previous studies and also ongoing studies focus on single individual sites or small districts of the oasis, whereas we are dealing simultaneously with a number of sites that have been excavated, as you can see here framed in red. These are currently 7 sites, and all of them, Kakishtovan, Iskitchgat, Ramitan, Site 250, Varaksha, Bukhara, and Paikent, they vary in size, but they are all multi-period sites. And the other distinction is that many of these studies focus in the first instance on the chronology. So they were trying to define chronological markers that help to immediately date the assemblages that archaeologists find. And that led to a sort of periodization of the pottery material in the oasis and drew sort of horizontal, invisible horizontal lines. And we, with our long-term perspective, are trying to transgress these lines a little bit. So we are taking a perspective from the beginning of the occupation right through to the Islamic period. And we want to some way dissolve this distinction between pre-Islamic and Islamic to understand the development as a continuous process. Now, the chronology of these research programs is important because each of the projects was, first of all, devised by its own and has its own aims and research strategies. The MAFOUB, because they wanted to explore the whole occupational sequence of the oasis, they used deep sounding to get the whole stratigraphic sequence of occupation of each site. And then they opened up large area excavations as needed to understand architectural developments in specific structural contexts. For absolute dating and independent dating, they were using 2 methods, radiocarbon dating, and that is still ongoing. So each excavation, in each excavation, as available charcoal samples are taken or bone samples, and they are radiocarbon dated. Whereas prior to our beginning our project, there was also a small series of luminescence dating that was undertaken on the pottery itself and on mud brick samples. The problem, well, both methods of dating have their own problems, and the thermoluminescence dating of the pottery is also very susceptible to depositional effects or environmental effects, and therefore it can be relatively inaccurate. And we haven't gone into that anymore because we are dealing with a lot of redeposited material. Whereas the radiocarbon dating, that is dating either the vegetal charcoal samples or the bone samples. But whether these samples within the deposit are contemporary to the pottery in the deposit is an old question. So again, we cannot simply refer to these dates and say, well, this is directly how the pottery is dated. We need to look at it independently. Now, just to give you an idea of some of the basic concepts in our study, and I have to say, as a student of Clive Orton's, of course, I'm very much influenced by the Anglophone methodologies and principles in studying the pottery. So we distinguish between live assemblage and death assemblage. The live assemblage is what you can use now. It consists of complete vessels, and you can see here an example of a contemporary live assemblage that I took in our hotel in Bukhara. And what we find as archaeologists is a death assemblage is a collection of fragmented pottery, and often these fragments do not compose to a single vessel or to several vessels, but they derive from various different vessels. In between the live assemblage and the death assemblage, there occurs breakage, initial breakage, and several depositional events. It's important then that we do not focus on the fragments themselves, but we try to infer from the assemblage of fragments information on the original live assemblage. And therefore, quantification is so important when dealing with fragmented pottery. Now, just a few statistical concepts, and I do not want to bother you with that too much, because I'm aware that many of you are not familiar with this and are not very interested in it either. But the basic issue is a definition of a single archaeological context that should represent ideally a single event, either an infill of a room, a laying of a floor, make-up layer, a pit, fill, something like that. And every ceramic fragment that is contained in this context makes up a single archaeological assemblage of ceramics. Now, if we think of the assemblage as a sample in a statistical sense, we want to know the relationship between this sample and the population. The population is the collection of complete vessels. Now, we cannot always make direct inferences because of the long period between the two events, having a set of complete vessels and having this heap of fragments. But it is important to understand and to try to understand the individual depositional events that took place from having a complete set of vessels to having a mixed heap of sherds. And we are trying to reconstruct information on this. So we are not only collecting information on the individual fragments that give us information on forms, on fabrics, on decorative schemes, but we also collect information on what had happened to these. Can we see, are the breaks very worn? Have they been exposed to water logging? Have they been exposed to fire? What has happened? And this makes up all the information that we collect on the sherds. And one of the most important principles, if we want to make full use of the advantages of quantification, of trying to refer to the originally complete vessel, is that we need to have a complete sample. That means we need to have a completely excavated archaeological context. And now you can see where we run into difficulties with a project that has already been running and had a different set of aims, because the deep sounding, all the context that you can see here in this cross section haven't been excavated completely. That means that we haven't complete samples. And this means we cannot make full use of the advantages of quantification. Now, this means that we had a two-step approach to our data. So for all the contexts that have not been excavated completely, we still quantify them, but we focus on information on the individual diagnostic sherds, that is the rim sherds, the base sherds, sherds that give us information on the individual types of vessel, on the individual forms of decoration, etc. So because we still can infer information between, the relationship between form and fabric, between the diameters used for certain vessel forms, etc., etc. But we cannot use information on the depositional history of that context so much, because we cannot fully quantify it. And for the large open area excavations, we can make full use of the quantification, that is also counting, weighing, average fragment size, and all these statistical measures. Now, another problem is, of course, that we are dealing simultaneously with different sites, and these sites have different occupational sequences. And each sequence is partly dated with scientific methods, partly through stratigraphy. Now, this diagram on the left is trying to illustrate the correlation between the different phases at the different sites. And if we then take the diagnostic rim sherds, for example, from these phases that were found in these phases, and we try to relate them to what we say equivalent of complete vessels, that is the way we quantify the material to have a relationship between the fragment and the complete vessel that it represents. And you can see that some of these phases are much better represented in our material than others. For example, the green phase, 9th to 12th century, that is much better represented because we were lucky, we had some pits on the sites, and they contained some complete vessels, some semi-complete vessels. So the proportion of information we have on the pottery of this period is much larger than for other periods. And this is important to know because it gives us also a handle on the reliability of our data. And as you can see, it's a long-term process. But what has all this fragmented material to do with material histories? Now, considering the different, considering fragmented material, we have, and pottery, we have largely three major perspectives that this material gives us on past societies. First of all, we have the perspective of the craftsperson, that is the technology that they apply, their skill that considers also, or that concerns also, the clay that they choose, the shaping of the vessel, how they can fire it, etc., etc. Then we have the perspective of the consumer, that is the person that goes and buys that product and uses it in their household for various different functions: storage, cooking, food preparation, transport, and on the table for serving, and form and function relate to what they were originally used for. Now, once a pot is broken, it cannot be used as a vessel anymore in most instances, but it's still reused and it still constitutes a resource. And what we find in all this redepositing of the material is many instances of reusing and recycling of the pottery as a resource. And Jacopo is going to tell you, or to give you some examples about this later on. Now, I'm going to just also refer to technology, the perspective of the craft person. The study, or this includes, of course, also the study of the pottery fabrics. Now, this again is twofold, because there is the part of the study of the fabrics that is undertaken in the field by us. So once we've recorded the quantifications, the pottery shapes, the decoration, etc., we break the pottery sherds, we make fresh breaks, and we look at these breaks. You can see here images of these fresh breaks, and we try to distinguish different groups. Now, because we are not experts in geology or anything, we just try to distinguish groups that make sense for us as either chronological markers or for functional distinctions. Now, the basic functional distinction is usually by the coarseness of the pottery, meaning the coarseness of the inclusion. Very coarse pottery is often used for food preparation or for cooking, something like that. And rather fine pottery is used for vessels for either storage or mainly also tableware. And you can see the distinction in coloring of these different fabric groups. And they mainly concern firing groups, because there is this general assumption that you start off with a lower temperature in the kiln, and with a if you use reduced atmosphere, it's going to be red, sometimes dark red, and it's getting, the fabric is getting lighter as the temperature is rising, and that is often a factor of increasing skills of the potter. And specifically, you do need a minimum, especially towards the Islamic period, when the glazed material starts and sets in. And fabric groups F, E, and I are also found with glazed material. So this also is important for the Islamic period. We haven't included streetwear, that's something entirely different. Now, the second part of this study is, of course, we want to know, are there any geological specifications or any differences in clay composition? Do we have any imports, etc., etc.? So we regularly sampled the pottery and we regularly exported samples. But at the moment, we only have results for the first batch that was only taken from Iskitchkat and from pre-Islamic material, from pre-Islamic material of the 2nd century BC to, let's say, 3rd, 4th century AD or CE. So we have the results here, and they are published in this 3rd volume. And what is important is that, first of all, there is, they come up with the fact that there is a global homogeneity between all the samples in terms of chemical and mineralogical characteristics. But what they also tried was follow our distinction of fabric for firing groups, and that proved to be impossible for them. So there is no petrographic foundation to our distinction. So it's really something different to work with the fabrics in the field, to have some idea about chronological development, and to have a lab analysis that gives you really the chemical composition. And we need both. And there are first results also for glaze wells, but I'm not commenting on this because we are having Carmen Ting, and now Dr. Carmen Ting, who is working at Leicester University, and she is just currently working on a large amount of samples from glazed fabrics of the Islamic period, as well as force wells. Now, another aspect of technology and the craftsman's or craftsperson's perspective is the shaping of vessels. And we always have this twofold distinction between hand shape and wheel shape. There is a lot of steps in between, partly hand shaped, shaped on a wheel, but not wheel thrown. I give you just an example. We have here 2 cookware pots. One is pre-Islamic and one of the Islamic period. Now the pre-Islamic one is still handmade. You see, relatively coarse. And of course, they come in various sizes, in various shapes, but they are still handmade, relatively thick walls and partly irregular. And on the right side, you can see a pot of the early Islamic period found in one pit. And you see that it's wheel thrown. It's relatively thin walled. It's very hard fired. So there is a distinction of using techniques or changing techniques through time. But it's also important to note that we have a variety of techniques used simultaneously throughout. And it's very interesting to see with this long-term perspective how things change within certain groups of vessels. Here is also an example of a late antique bowl, and you can see specifically on the left side the traces of the trimming, but also on the right side you see that the vessel wasn't thrown on a very fast spinning wheel, but it was shaped in a composite way. And here also you have another example for trimming, for getting extra clay off the walls at the end of the manufacturing process. And these ripples that you see here in the upper part of the shirt, they are very distinctive because that derives from a tool that you're trying to shave off as if you were using a knife, the extra clay, and then because it rotates on the wheel, you starting to get these rhythmic bounces. And this can be accidentally happening, but it can also be used deliberately as a decorative technique. And this lower shirt, you could find very similarly also in other areas of Central Asia, contemporary areas like Margiana, like Nisa, etc. So it gives you another idea of common basis of technological know-how. So this is another handle that we have. And with this, I hand over to Jacopo.
Thank you very much, Gabriele, and thank you, Daniel, for organizing this section. And I just want to present here some example that I think that would be useful to exemplify what Gabriele is already saying. In order to what we have when we dealing with pottery from complex excavation from a long-term perspective. You should bear in mind the chart that Gabriele showed you with the differences between within our assemblage. When some parts of some periods, some chronological phase are more represented than others, and that's of course reflected also in these slides. What I want to show you here, for example, with the some of very simple shapes, is the appearance of these shapes in very different periods. For example, here you can see these small bowl or cups, as you prefer, that appear starting from the antiquity period to have this huge amount this huge quantity during the late pre-Islamic and the early Islamic period. So what does it mean? Well, there are two options as always, and maybe they are linked together. So is a continuity of the use through the time of the same shapes, or we are in front of intrusive material or residual material that is linked to the archaeological activities, where probably the archaeologist already knows the Sherds has these habits. They swim the soil up and down. So we usually found, it's very often we found some Sherds of different periods in layers that sometimes are dated to a completely different one. So next, please. Here another example. These kind of shapes, we have a huge amount of samples that comes from the late antique period, especially in the chronological horizon between the second, third, second, fourth century CE. But then again, we found them in the period between the 10th and 12th century CE. Again, what does it mean? A continuity in the production, so we continue to have this kind of shapes produced several centuries later. It is possible, but in this case, we are quite sure that it's an occasion of redeposition. So we have sherds that we can refer to the late antique period that continue to appear for whatever reason in the layers that we can date to the early Islamic period. Next. Here again. And as you can see, it's even more complicated because they are very simple shapes. So simple shapes could be used and produced for a very long period of time. And in fact, the sequence showed the presence of similar shapes through the whole sequence of our assemblages, with a huge amount during the 10th, 12th century. And again, bear in mind that it's from the period where we have the most part of our material. Again, next. Here again, another example from the other part of the spectrum. So it seems that these kind of shapes were produced, starting to be produced during the last century BCE and the first century CE, with a huge amount of production during the second, third centuries. And again, we can follow up some continuity of use or reuse of this shape during the pre-Islamic period. Next. Here again, basically is the same as the previous one. We have a clear information about these kind of big plates. Next. While if we move to the closed shapes, of jars and jugs, we have completely different pictures. So in this case, again, we have shapes, very simple shapes that are linked to a specific use, so related to liquids, sometimes also to other solids, but especially liquids. So if we consider our shapes as a functional shapes, and we consider that that function is continued through the whole sequence, well, we can expect to have similar shapes to the whole sequence. But that again, that will be a problematic because we already know how sometimes sherds of previous periods can continue to appear in the layers dated to later periods. We can move quickly through the next slides. What I want to underline here is not as clear as it seems. It's kind of a critic to the spot dating, something that we as archaeologists, we are always tempted to do. So sherds equal chronology. Yes, but we can always consider the continuity of the production. We can move on the next slide. The continuity of production of similar shapes through the period, the whole sequence of the human occupation of an area, as well as the problem of the residual material. Next, please. Here again, as you can see, the same pictures in the graphs again. Next. This is interesting because it's some of the shapes that Gabriele showed in the previous slides, those well-made cooking vessel that has some, let's say, ancestors in the 3rd century BCE, 1st century CE, or we can talk here about intrusive material that comes from above, because it seems to us quite clear that these shapes are produced and used mostly in the early Islamic period. Next. Same as some very specific and diagnostic shapes that are very recognizable. This kind of jugs with a very heavy handle are quite specific, and that in fact we recognize those in levels that are referring to the early Islamic period. And it is quite common also in the literature of the Central Asian area. Next. Problematic are, as we will see later on, are the storage jars that in the Central Asian literature are called kums. The storage jars, these very simple and common shapes that is spread everywhere in every period, but those that we are considering here, as you can see, we can have a quantity of information related to the 5th to the 6th century CE, and then in the early and middle Islamic period. And I show you why in a second. And next. Another interesting shapes is that of the lid. Lids are start to be quite common between the late antique period and the pre-Islamic, the late pre-Islamic period and the early Islamic period. And the lids, the appearance of the lids is quite interesting, relating to the perspective of the consumer. Which is the use of a lid, of course, of closing a vessel. Yes. Sometimes we notice on those lids traces of firing, of boring, or traces residues of something that it's burnt. So we can suppose that those lids were using during the cooking activities, so for boiling something. It is possible to boiling something without a lid? Yes, of course, but with a lid it's easier. So what does it imply? Imply that the boiling activities are more common during this period? is a question, and that's a question that we can also ask to our colleagues who deal with other materials. For, I don't know, for the animal remains, we can ask if they recognize boiling activities, more boiling activities instead open fire. And we try starting link all this data in order to get more information to the habits of the cooking habits and the eating habits of the population. Next, this it's another example of lids, different shapes, but as you can see, same pictures from a chronological point of view. Next. I want to spend a few words on the slip painted decoration, because these also had sometimes used as the shapes as a chronological marker. Indeed, it is a chronological marker, but with all the problems that we already mentioned. Next, please. As you can see here, we have a very simple slip cover vessels. And the presence of the slips is quite common between the antique and late antique period. But again, as you can see here, we found some sherds in the chronological phase of the 10th, 12th century CE. And again, those testify for a residual presence of these elements. Next, please. The same is true for these trickling partner. It's simply some very liquid slip that is poured over the shoulder of the big storage jars, creating this kind of decorative motifs. And this is quite interesting because we can recognize in our assemblage and also in the literature that is quite common of the period between antiquity and late antiquity. But as you can see from the graphs, it continues to appear through the whole sequence. And this is interesting to show you why this is happening in our, at least in our assemblage. Please, next. We can reconstruct a kind of evolution of these decoration in the different sites that we have considered and from the different period. But what is more interesting, next slide, are the pattern of reuse and recycle of these kind of vessels. We have, in several occasions, very well preserved vessels that, according to our data and according to the comparison in the literature, should be referred to, say, the late antique period. Well, we find sherds of this vessel, or also complete, almost complete vessels in context that we can date to the early Islamic period. Why? Because they were reused in a sewering system like the badrabs, so this row of vessels that were used to create the sewer, or they could be smashed in order to cover, to prepare a pavement, in order to isolate the pavement from the waters, or also to cover the walls, the lower part of walls, for the same reason, to protect them from the water. Next, please. As you can see, the state of conservation of these sherds, it's quite good. The breakage is quite clear and neat. There is not much incrustation, so it shows that there isn't in this case a long depositional history. So it seems that they were break, how can I say, slightly earlier of the moment where they put in place as the preparation for a pavement. But the problem is that, according to our data, those should be dated several centuries before this level, that, according to the archaeologists, should, and to the absolute dating, should be dated between around the 13th century CE. So here again, a quite clear example of how it's complicated and how it is less clear than it seems when we deal with pottery. And this is the reason, next slide, please, is the reason to refer to the quantitative data, to check the sherds not only in relation of the presence of the absence of specific shapes, a specific decoration, but also the quantity and the characteristic of the sherds that we have in our archaeological infills. A few words on what would be from the next week my project at the Austrian Academy of Science. It's linked to what we already say in the previous slide. So my aim is to use the pottery data to try to understand the human habits and the developments of the human habits in the Bukhara Oasis through what we can say the long first millennium. So when the oasis start to become inhabitable by drying of the swampy area formerly consist, through the emergence of the oasis into the written sources when the Bukhara Oasis began part of the Umayyad and then Abbasid Caliphate. The problem is that this phase, so between, let's say, the 1st century BCE to the 8th, 9th century CE, is poorly covered by written sources. So, as the work of Florian Schwarz showed, our main data for referring to these periods are data related to the material culture. For me, pottery. And why pottery? I hope that it's clear by now, but again, pottery is the object that derive from the antiquity that is the most linked to the humans. You can imagine pottery as plastic. Everybody used plastic. We have plastic everywhere. The same was true in the antiquity for pottery. And studying the long-term development, the long-term change or pattern of resilience of the pottery could provide us with information on the changes or not, on the behaviors of the human beings that used those pots. In order to do so also, next please, we are trying to create a common agenda and a network of specialists who are now working on the Central Asia pottery. Why so? Not only to share the data, but to share a common methodology. As I think it's quite clear from the presentation made by Gabriele, the importance of the methodology, the importance of how we collect data, because how we collect data, the way we collect data can have huge influence of what we can get from those data. So trying to arrange a common methodology, that means that we can, in the end of the process, have data that are linked to each other, that could be put one side by the others. And with our colleague Agnese Fusaro of the International University of Siena in Italy, we are trying to move the first step towards this common. And I think that next we can thank you all for your attention.
Well, thank you very much for that very interesting presentation. Go turn things over now to Michael Shankar for some commentary and questions for our presenters.
Yeah, hello everyone. Can you can you all hear me? Good. Yeah, thank you very much, Gabriele and Bruno, for this very interesting presentation about the work that you are doing in the Bukhara Oasis. And I would like, of course, to thank Daniel for inviting me to be here today. I think that I'm far from obvious choice to respond to this presentation and to this research, because I work on the other end of the Sogdian civilization, in the eastern part of the Zarafshan Valley, in the upper Zarafshan, and I'm familiar perhaps with the Samarkand Oasis, but of course not with what is going on in Bukhara. And I must say that I'm very impressed with the work that you are trying to do and the research that you are doing on pottery. I'll start from the end, Bruno, about the network that you are trying to organize. That could be a very useful idea, and I would suggest you to add my student from Tajikistan, Abdurrahman Pulotov, who is currently the director of the National Museum of Antiquities in Dushanbe, and he's writing his dissertation on the pottery of the Upper Zarafshan region, mainly of Penjikent and Sanjar-Shah, but also of the other sites in the region. I'm sure he will be happy to join. But first of all, I would the good thing about being a respondent is that I can ask as many questions as I want without the danger of being impolite to other participants. So I have a few questions, but first of all, perhaps for those in our audience who are not archaeologists, and all this research on pottery perhaps does not always make a lot of sense. Well, pottery, of course, is very important, but it is usually used for two things. One is chronology, to establish the chronology of the layers and of the finds or the other finds. And the second is to derive from it some information about the culture and the history of the people who created it and used it, as we've seen from what Gabriele and Bruno are trying to do. I'm very impressed with your attempt to analyze assemblages from 7 sites. It is challenging. It's also challenging, I think, because although all your 7 sites are situated more or less in a single environmental area, that may be an advantage for the Bukhara Oasis, because for us, for example, for the Upper Zarafshan region, the situation is completely different. We have different regions, we have mountains, and we have lowlands and valleys, and the same is true for the Kashkadaria region of southern Sogdiana. And the pottery and the material culture in general is quite distinctive. So here you have the advantage that all the sites are situated in one environmental zone of the Bukhara Oasis, but nevertheless, I wonder how sensible you are to the fact that this, the nature of these sites is quite different, because well, Sogdiana was never, until quite late, until the Arab conquest, was never a single state. The Bukhara Oasis was probably not united. All these sites, certainly Paikand and Ramitan, other sites, they were independent principalities. So the material culture also was different. And we know it again from well excavated sites such as Varakhsha and Paikand. And in your presentation, I saw very little evidence of differentiation between the sites like what we do, for example, in the Zarafshan Valley. I was very impressed by your also by the quantitative approach. If I understood you correctly, you collect, you register, and you study not only indicative or diagnostic sherds, but all the sherds that you find. Again, just for our audience, for those who are not archaeologists, diagnostic sherds are the sherds that we can, according to one sherd, we can reconstruct the entire vessel. Such sherds are usually minority. So the majority of sherds are just fragments from the body of the vessel, and it is usually impossible to tell what was the original shape of the vessel. So usually, and also in our excavations, we don't keep and we do not study such sherds. We just throw them away. We only keep and register only the diagnostic sherds. And you mentioned that the quantification of this of all the sherds, which is, by the way, an enormously time-consuming work. You mentioned that it has a lot of advantages. So I would be very interested if you can elaborate more. What can you learn, I mean, in your research from such quantifications? What else? I have one major issue to raise, although Bruno, you touched upon it in your, I mean, at the end of your presentation, telling us that will be your next project. But of course, during your presentation and listening to it and looking at the material, I kept asking myself, what are the major questions that you're looking to answer in terms of what do you expect to learn from your study about the culture and the history? I'll give you a few examples from our region in Eastern Sogdian, in Samarkand Oasis, and in Kashkadaria. For example, in the 5th and 6th centuries, we see that there were different pottery workshops active in every place. And by the second half of the 7th century, we see suddenly that the Pan-Sogdian canon of pottery emerges in the Zarafshan, in the eastern central Zarafshan Valley, and also in Kashkadaria. That means more or less the same pottery shapes are found in Kashkadaria, in Samarkand, and in Penjikent. And Marshak, for example, derived from this fact historical conclusions. He thought, for example, that it means that we see here finally the emergence of what he called Sogdian ethnic continuity. So do you see something similar from your research in the Bukhara Oasis, and what would be your conclusions? About the red sleep, by the way, Bruno, I mean, in Penjikent, red sleep seems to disappear by the end of the 7th century. We don't have it at all. And from what you've shown us, it seems like in Bukhara Oasis it disappeared already in the 5th century. I mean, that's minor remark. And just going back to this Pansogdian continuity, I mean, in the ceramic shapes, what does it mean? It means that we see that from the 6th century CE, and certainly in the 7th and in the 8th, the handmade pottery, which is very important, in the Upper Zarafshan and in Kashkadarya, becomes very close. Why handmade pottery and not wheel-made? Because, again, and I would like also to hear what you think as people who professionally study ceramic, because we archaeologists, we usually perceive handmade pottery as more local, in contrast with wheel-made pottery, which sometimes tends to be exported to other regions. For example, again, from the Samarkand Oasis, a good example is the pottery from Kafir Kalla, which is very distinctive. It has this metallic components of stone that looks like metallic, and we find them in Penjikent, for example. We find them in other sites, so they were exported to other sites. But usually handmade pottery, we perceive it as locally produced. So when we see that handmade pottery in Kashkadarya Valley and in Upper Zarafshan becomes very close and similar, does it suggest the same people? Yes, for our region, by the way, if we increase our resolution and if we look on the Upper Zarafshan region, and please excuse me for coming back to it all the time, because this is the region that I'm familiar with. Usually the distinction is very clear. Wheel-made pottery dominates the valleys and cities like Penjikent and Sanjar Shah, and in the mountains we have handmade pottery. Yeah, so thank you very much again for your presentation, and I'll be happy to hear your comments and your thoughts.
Thank you. Shall I go first with a few general remarks? Well, there are some really important issues that you mentioned here, especially also it's important to explain in an audience that is not usually archaeologically or familiar with archaeological work. Now, I maybe start with your last point. I mean, regarding imports and you know, the movement of pottery from one place to another as commodity. We usually only consider something imported if we have proven it by petrographic studies to be from a different region. Now, within the Bukhara Oasis, at the moment, we only have a comparison between some of the fragments that were analyzed from Vardana, that is very much in the north of the oasis, and the sherds that we've submitted from Iskitchkat. And there is some distinction, but the chemical composition is so homogeneous that it's going to be difficult to distinguish between different sites within the oasis. Nevertheless, I would consider that preliminary, because we have another run of about 120 samples currently being analyzed from all the different sites that we were studying. So we have to await the results from these places. But to give you an example, I was very surprised by the results that we received at Merv from the chemical analysis, because in the pre-Islamic period, for example, we had absolutely zero imports. There was not, amongst 300 samples, not a single import except and save for one horseware. So they weren't interested at all in the wheel-thrown vessel. They weren't interested at all in the nice material, but the horseware had some inclusions that they were obviously keen because it would impact on the property of the vessel. So it can be deceptive to assume that nicely made pottery or pottery that seems nice to us was desirable for being traded as commodity. Mostly the pottery is traded as containers. Now, we haven't gotten up to that stage to be able to comment really on trade within the oasis. We know we found remains of pottery kilns in Ramitan, and we assume, I mean, obviously there is a huge potter's quarter in Paiken that have been excavated, but that belongs to the Islamic period. So we haven't got kilns associated for every single period within the oasis, and we haven't got kilns for every single site. So we cannot at the moment say anything about production centers at various periods, but certainly we are trying through the petrographic analysis to get as close as we can, and also by studying the methods of shaping. Now, what is interesting in terms of cultural interferences that cultural inferences that you made for your area of the contact between the different regions. Now, the very interesting finding that we have so far is that Bukhara seems to be a disjunction of various different cultural areas, because right from the outset, we do find material that is very close to the rest of Sogdia, that is also reminiscent of the typical, goblet culture that we find in late Hellenistic context in Central Asia. But we also find contact through what I showed through the technology of the trimming and shaping with areas like Margiana and Nisa and Parthia. And what is also interesting through this trickling clip paint and what we saw, the vessel styles of that type, they are related to Chach, and they are, Tashkent oasis. And often they've also been put into context with nomadic populations, etc. But what we see from our evidence in the oasis is that all of this happens at the same time in the same places. We have no indication that different types of clay were used on these different vessels. And therefore, I assume that it's difficult to associate specific forms of decoration with specific people that lived within the oasis. I do not want to have any ethnic attribution at the moment. We have to be very careful, because that's something that is very tricky occasionally. So we are looking at the production over different stages of development. And the thing that I wanted to also comment on the quantification and the advantages. Yes, we are keeping everything, every little unattractive piece, and we are counting them and weighing them. And if you divide the weight by the count, you get a statistic measure, which is the average fragment weight, which is also known as average fragment size. And this gives you an idea of what happened to that context, because if you are close to a primary context, a context that had only been thrown in a pit and left there, for example, and you have nearly complete vessels, then you should have a very high rate of completeness. And if you have a very fragmented context, it indicates that a lot of depositional events happen to the material in that context. That means that the original date of production of the vessel is relatively far removed from the date of deposition of this context. This is very important, and you can, this is statistically relevant data, and you have to have lots and lots to make it viable. So this is why we keep collecting, and the conclusions that we can draw at the moment are preliminary, but we hope by collecting further and finally having sets of quantified materials for each site, we can start at looking at what at the different sites is happening, as you said, not just combining all of them and having a go through all the periods, but also trying to distinguish what is happening at the different individual sites, and do they actually show any distinction in the range of productions that they have, in the functionalities of the set of pottery, and does that change through the occupational levels of these individual sites? And unfortunately, and this is something I wanted to make clear, unfortunately, and it's, you know, no fault, I'm not accusing any archaeologists here, but the problem is a lot of archaeologists find it necessary, according to their strategies and aims, to make deep sounding. But the deep sounding prevents any meaningful quantification of the material. We really prefer open area excavations. And of course, that limits, again, the range of periods that we get to, because we can only ever get to the periods that are relatively close to the surface, because nobody's going to dig a trench, I don't know, 20 square meters, 10 meters deep, that's clear. So the difficulty is that the lower we get, the earlier the material gets, the more restricted our view is going to be for our material. I mean, there may be longer term projects elsewhere in the oasis that have a better chance of getting better material there. But the main thing is that, yes, we keep all the material because it gives us indications about what happened to the pottery. And that, again, gives us additional implications about contemporaneity and relative date. And with that, I hand over to you, Jacopo, for the research questions and things that you have.
Well, mainly you answered to all the point, starting from the first question, of course, the network. Yes, thank you very much for suggesting. Actually, I was hoping in some comment like that, because so we choose to put that slide about network activities in order to get comment and suggestion from the audience. So absolutely, we will contact him. What relating to the quantitative analysis and the importance of quantification is already said. Related to handmade potteries as local, will made as maybe imports or not, it's already answered. I just want to underline again that, of course, a pottery is moving as a container. So the important thing is always, not always, but most of the times, it's what is inside the pot, not the pot itself. So maybe we have a ugly pot, but with precious content. So the ugly pot could move far away. As for the specific aims and objectives of my project, well, it's from the archaeological point of view, the main aspect that I want to consider is to try to reconstruct an independent ceramic sequence for the oasis based on the data that we are collecting. Of course, with comparison also to the previous results derived from the literature. That plus all the analysis of the traces of use and reuse of the pots and sherds, in order to get an insight on what was the intended use and the actual use of the pots that we have in our sequence, and how these can change or not. So the pattern of change and the resilience through the time. And comparing also all these information, so shapes and use, with a broader regional horizon. Why do that? Because I want to consider these first millennium of the Bukhara Oasis as a, let's say, a prehistoric period. So I want to try to reconstruct what we have, starting from the material data, not to be, at least at the beginning, influenced by the historical sources or what the historical sources said. So thanks to the fact that we have a lot of information derived from the absolute chronology, so C14, luminescence analysis, and so on and so forth, we can reconstruct an independent sequence linked to an absolute datum. And then, against this chronological grid, we can check whether these pattern of change and resilience are linked or not to the major Central Asian dynamics. So movement of people, changing in political organization, whatever. So, and to understand whether these major historical changes that we know from the historical sources affect the material culture of the oasis. So I use the oasis as a cross section for something bigger, of course. But what I really want to understand is whether some major historical events have an impact on the life of the population, and this impact we can measure this impact, and the only thing we can measure what it changed from the everyday lives, so the activities of the people and the agency of the people on the object, and vice versa. So when those change, and how much they change, and this change is related to a major historical event, or vice versa. When we know that there is a major historical events, we have change in the material culture, yes or no? If yes, okay, we can say it's linked. It's not, what it happens that this change that for us as archaeologists, as historians, is very important, have no results, have no effects on the common people. But maybe there is effects on the common people, but that happens, I don't know, 1-2 generation after, and so on and so forth. So trying to, as my project is, as the title of my project, to create an unwritten material history. So really based on the aspect, the material aspect that we can have about the humans and the human behaviors, because as we told, also the different change in the habits in cooking, drinking, and eating habits. We can study that starting from the pottery as a container, as a plate used for eating, or as a vessel used to drink. Of course, this will link also to other studies. We are lucky enough in the Bukhara Oasis, because we are now several studies that are dealing with the archaeozoology, that are dealing with the archaeobotany, so we can really link different elements. But of course, if animals and plants are foods, okay, but people eat food in plates. So linking these different elements provide, can let us to reconstruct what are the habits, the common habits and the behaviors of the people in the oasis. I hope to have answer to the comment. Okay, thank you. And I think that there are those in the main comments. I hope not. Okay.
Well, thank you very much for that discussion. I want to save a little bit of time now for any questions from the audience. If anyone would like to ask any questions for our presenters. Janine.
Yes, hello.
Nice to see you.
Nice to see you too, thanks. So obviously this is a question that might seem very odd to you, like coming from somebody who's not an archaeologist at all. I was wondering, you were talking about you have the sherds and you have the kiln. Do you also see clay pits? Or could you sort of, I mean, because obviously these places also get depleted at a certain point. So can you see them at all? And do they move around? Do people change them? Do you see something like this? Could also be a question like for major events, not in the sense of political events, but like weather events or environmental events or so. So would that be another kind of information that you can get?
Well, that information depends a lot also on the information we get from the archaeologists. What we can say, what is really interesting is that we do have different occupational sequences at the same sites in different areas. So we, for example, in Ramitan, we do have a period of abandonment of the citadel area, while life in the Rabat is going on or is starting. So you have different phases of life at different parts of the site. Why that is, at the moment, I cannot tell you, because we need more archaeological information or information from archaeologists. You would need probably to ask the excavators to get that information. Regarding the kilns, the problem is that there were kiln sites, for example, in Ramitan, but they were only noticed the moment that they were destroyed by bulldozers to, repair channels or to provide new channels. And the problem is that we are dealing with constant and uncontrolled destruction also of archaeological evidence within the oasis, and we can only catch up. So it's sort of archaeological luck to find kilns that belong to specific periods. They were very lucky in Paikent. We are not that lucky in Ramitan. We were considering, or specifically Jacopo wanted to get to the kilns at Ramitan, but the archaeologists tried this year and said that what was remaining from the kilns is now concreted over by other building development. So this is also archaeological chance sometimes. So it's difficult. But regarding the abandonment of parts of a site or also of entire sites, that is something that is worked upon by the archaeologists in the first instance, and we are relating to that information as well. Yes. Thank you.
Any other questions or comments? Fiona. You're muted. Yeah.
Yes. Hi. First of all, I just wanted to say thank you to Gabriele and Jacopo for all of your publications on the pottery from the Bukhara Oasis. I've enjoyed them and learned a lot from them, and the attention to detail is fabulous. So thank you, not just to the technology, but to the decoration and everything. So thank you. I have 3 questions, in fact. The first one, Jacopo, you mentioned something about or actually maybe Gabriele, it was you, sorry, something about the contact through technology with Nisa and Margiana. And it raises for me this long question about itinerant potters. So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about that. It's something that I've thought about from the craft production perspective, including pottery. So I'd be interested to hear your thoughts. That's the first question. The second question, in terms of the provenance, I'm wondering if you've done any clay sampling just at the various, or if the archaeologists have done any clay sampling at the various different sites, because that can also, when analyzed petrographically, help you to understand the whole question of provenance. And my third question is about the form typology based on the fabrics. I'm wondering if that's, as far as I can see from the publication, you haven't done it there, but I'm wondering if that's something that you're considering doing, and if that would, what bearing that might have on the way you understand technologies and forms and potentially different groups operating at the various sites. Thanks.
Thank you. First of all, the itinerant potters, Jacopo, you can comment from Nisa, because Jacopo was studying Nisa. Well, from Margiana up to the last 2 seasons, I would have said there is absolutely no common material or anything common traces. But then I saw these ways of trimming, of shaping, of chattering, and this is very familiar with the material from there. Plus, at Ramitan, we got also from the last years, and it's in our blog, some of the shapes, you know, these Tagara shapes that were very popular in Bactria, but also in Margiana. And so there seems to be some common traces as well there in this direction, not only Church, but also very much, and not only Bactria, but also very much towards the southwest. And then just the provenance, yes, we need to do the clay sampling, and we are in the process of developing the petrographic analysis, and that is certainly a way that we need to take. We've done that at MERV, and yes, we need to do that. And the other thing is regarding the fabric and form. At the moment, what is interesting to see is again that we have shapes that are produced in fine or in common wear and coarse wear. So there is no clear distinction between fabric and shape at the moment. But as I said, you know, we are depending also on the results. And now I just hand over to Jacopo for answering the rest.
Yeah, I link from the last, yeah, of course, the typology based on form and fabric, it's one of the aim of our research, but since the excavation is going on and the processing of the material is going on, we are now, let's say, stuck on our preliminary results in that sense, but will be, of course, one of our objectives. As for itinerant potters, that's a very good question. Unfortunately, I cannot answer to that because it's more related to probably itinerant archaeologists. What I mean that we recognize similar patterns because we already seen from the sites where we excavated. So I don't know whether a potter from Nisa moved through Margiana till Bukhara Oasis. It's quite possible because it was one of the common path, but it was a common path for me as well. But I really don't have any information about that. The other things that I can say is that the technique, it's quite interesting, quite recognizable, but it's not a complex technique. It's not like thinking, I don't know, the raku for Japan that is very specific and require very, very specific kilns and way of production and clay, etc., etc., etc. It's quite simple. So could be imitation, could be common discovery, independent discovery in several places. So basing our data only of this kind of decoration, we cannot say that much. There is, I don't think, is the smoking gun that say it's itinerant potters. So I would say more itinerant archaeologists in that sense.
Any final questions or comments? I think we have time for one more question if anyone has anything. Okay, well, I think we will wrap things up there then. Thank you very much to all our presenters, to Gabriele and Jacopo, and thank you especially to Michael for your very informative feedback on this. I certainly learned a lot. Pottery is very far from what I do, so this was a very educational experience for me. Like I said, the recording will be available on our website after a week or two. So thank you again, everyone. Have a good night. Bye-bye.